She stood frozen in the parking lot, staring at the embossed invitation that had just arrived by courier, her hands trembling slightly as she read the elegant calligraphy that spelled out her nephew Brandon's wedding details. And then her eyes landed on the small notepaper clipped to the corner, a hastily written message in Brandon's unmistakable handwriting that said, "Aunt Rachel, there have been some changes to the guest list due to budget constraints, and unfortunately, we had to make some difficult decisions. So while we appreciate everything you've done for our family over the years, we've decided to limit the wedding to immediate family only, which means you won't be attending. But we hope you understand, and we'll celebrate with you another time." The words hit her like a physical blow, each phrase carefully constructed to sound apologetic while delivering a rejection that felt calculated and cold. And what Brandon didn't know, what he couldn't possibly have known because he'd never bothered to ask about the details of her professional life beyond polite holiday conversation, was that Rachel Hartman wasn't just any aunt being casually removed from a wedding guest list. She was a senior underwriter at Premier Life Insurance Company, the very company that held the $5 million event liability policy that Brandon and his bride-to-be Melissa had purchased to protect their elaborate destination wedding at an exclusive resort in the Florida Keys. And that policy, with all its coverage for cancellations and accidents and unforeseen disasters, was currently sitting on Rachel's desk, awaiting her final signature for approval. Hey there, beautiful souls, this is Tina, and I am so incredibly grateful that you've chosen to spend this time with me today. You know, in this space we've created together, we've become more than just a channel and viewers. We've become a community of friends who gather to share stories that touch our hearts, challenge our perceptions, and remind us of the complex beauty of human nature in all its messy, complicated glory. Today I'm bringing you Rachel's story, and let me tell you, this one is going to take you on a journey through family betrayal, professional integrity, and one of those perfect moments when the universe aligns to show people exactly who they've been underestimating and dismissing. If you've ever felt invisible to the people who should see you most clearly, if you've ever been pushed aside, like your presence doesn't matter by the very family members who should cherish you, then this story is going to resonate deep in your soul. Stay with me all the way to the end, because the way this unfolds is absolutely remarkable. And there's a profound lesson here about respect, dignity, and the unexpected ways our professional and personal lives can intersect in moments that change everything. And hey, if you're connecting with the stories we share here, go ahead and show some love with that like button and hit subscribe so we can keep building this amazing community together. Now, let me tell you about Rachel and how a simple insurance policy became the most powerful lesson her nephew would ever learn. Rachel Hartman had built her career over 23 years in the insurance industry, starting as a claims processor fresh out of college and working her way up through determination and meticulous attention to detail that had made her one of the most respected underwriters in the southeastern United States, handling complex policies for high-value events, celebrity weddings, corporate galas, and elaborate private celebrations where the financial stakes were measured in millions of dollars. She wasn't someone who bragged about her position or flaunted her professional authority. She simply showed up every day with quiet competence and made decisions that protected her company from catastrophic losses while helping clients secure the coverage they needed for their important events. Her reputation in the industry was beyond reproach. Insurance brokers specifically requested her for difficult cases. Attorneys knew better than to try intimidating her during claim disputes, and her colleagues at Premier Life treated her assessments with the kind of deference usually reserved for seasoned medical diagnosticians, because when Rachel Hartman said a policy was too risky to underwrite or needed specific exclusions to be viable, she was inevitably proven right when similar events went sideways in exactly the ways she'd predicted. Her personal life had always been quieter and more grounded than the high-stakes professional world she navigated daily, centered around her marriage to David, a high school history teacher whose steady warmth and genuine kindness provided the perfect counterbalance to the calculated risk assessment that dominated her work life. Her nephew Brandon had been special to her since he was born 27 years ago, the first grandson in the family after a string of granddaughters. The little boy who used to climb into her lap during family gatherings and ask endless questions about how insurance worked and why people needed protection for things that might never happen. She'd been present for every major milestone in his life. His first day of kindergarten, when he'd cried until Rachel had promised to pick him up herself that afternoon. His high school graduation, where he'd specifically thanked her in his speech for always believing in his potential. His college acceptance to the University of Miami, where he'd called her first, even before telling his parents because he knew she'd understand how much it meant to him. When Brandon had called her 9 months ago to announce his engagement to Melissa, a social media manager for luxury brands with an Instagram following in the hundreds of thousands, Rachel had been genuinely happy for him, despite her private reservations about whether Melissa's carefully curated online persona reflected the reality of who she was beneath the filters and professional photography. The engagement had been a whirlwind of escalating extravagance, with Melissa's parents apparently having significant wealth and a determination to fund a wedding that would serve as both a celebration and a marketing opportunity. Rachel had watched from the sidelines as the simple beach ceremony Brandon had initially described transformed into a 3-day destination wedding extravaganza at an exclusive Florida Keys resort with 250 guests, a celebrity event planner imported from Los Angeles, and a photography team that cost more than most people's annual salary. Brandon had seemed increasingly overwhelmed by the planning process, calling Rachel occasionally late at night expressing doubts about whether things were getting out of hand, wondering aloud if maybe they should scale back and focus on something more intimate and personally meaningful. Rachel had reassured him that wedding planning was stressful for everyone, and that what truly mattered was the marriage itself and the commitment they were making to build a life together. She'd offered practical advice when he'd asked, helped him understand the insurance requirements for destination weddings, explained the difference between liability coverage and cancellation protection, walked him through what various exclusions meant and why certain coverage limits made sense for events of different scales, all of it offered freely, because that's what family did. Then Melissa had decided that their wedding needed comprehensive insurance coverage, $5 million, to adequately protect against the various risks associated with their elaborate plans. Brandon had called Rachel about this, explaining that Melissa's event planner had recommended Premier Life Insurance Company, and he was planning to work with a broker to get the application submitted and approved quickly, since they were now less than 4 months away from their wedding date. Rachel had listened with professional interest, mentally making notes about the policy requirements and the timeline challenges, and she'd told Brandon honestly that yes, Premier Life did handle high-value event insurance, and she was actually one of the underwriters who reviewed those applications, but she'd be happy to recuse herself from handling his policy if he preferred to avoid any perception of conflict of interest. Brandon had laughed and told her that was ridiculous, that he trusted her professional judgment completely and would actually feel more comfortable having someone he knew review his application. Rachel had felt that familiar warmth of being valued and trusted by someone she loved, and she'd promised Brandon that if his application came across her desk, she would handle it with her usual thoroughness. The formal invitation had arrived at her home 6 months before the wedding date, an elaborate affair delivered by private courier in a hand-assembled presentation box filled with layers of tissue paper and ribbon and multiple cards detailing the 3-day event schedule. She'd immediately marked all the dates on her calendar, blocking out the entire weekend because this was Brandon's wedding, and she'd been looking forward to it with genuine excitement. The insurance application had landed on Rachel's desk 3 months before the wedding, submitted through a broker Rachel knew professionally, and she'd opened the file with her usual professional interest before the names had jumped out at her: Brandon Michael Hartman and Melissa Nicole Patterson, requesting $5 million in comprehensive event liability coverage for a destination wedding scheduled for exactly the dates Rachel had blocked off on her personal calendar to attend as a beloved family member and honored guest. She'd stared at that application for several long moments, recognizing immediately that this situation required careful thought and deliberate decision-making about how to proceed ethically and appropriately. As she began her standard review process, reading through the event details and vendor contracts and resort documentation, she'd started noticing elements that would have concerned her, regardless of who had submitted the paperwork. The timeline was aggressive, just under 4 months between application submission and event date, which left very little margin for corrections if issues arose during the review process. The vendor list included several companies that Rachel recognized as having questionable track records, not necessarily incompetent, but rather operating on the margins of reliability. The kind of vendors who delivered acceptable results when everything went smoothly, but tended to have problems when complications arose. The resort documentation was incomplete, missing specific liability certificates that Premier Life required for destination venue coverage, lacking clear protocols for weather-related emergencies given that they were planning an outdoor ceremony in the Florida Keys during hurricane season. Most concerning to Rachel's trained professional assessment was the overall financial structure of the event, which showed clear signs of what she privately called optimism bias, the tendency of people planning major events to underestimate costs and overestimate their ability to absorb unexpected expenses. The $5 million coverage request was substantial, but Rachel wasn't convinced it was adequate given the scope of events described in the application, the number of high-risk elements involved, and the destination location with its inherent logistical challenges. Before I go any further with Rachel's story, I want to pause here and just connect with you heart to heart for a moment. Because if you're still with me right now, if Rachel's situation is speaking to something in your own experience, then I want you to know that I see you and I understand what it feels like to be taken for granted by the very people who should value you most. This community we're building together, it's so much more than just watching videos and moving on with our day. It's about creating a space where real people share real stories and we learn from each other's experiences. I would love for you to drop a comment below and share your own story about a time when family didn't see you clearly, when you had to make difficult professional decisions that affected personal relationships because your story matters and your voice deserves to be heard. And if you haven't subscribed yet, I'm asking you to do that now because we're building something really special here, a community where authentic stories get told and real healing happens. Now let's get back to Rachel's story, because what she discovers next is going to absolutely blow your mind. Rachel had spent 2 full days reviewing Brandon and Melissa's application with the same meticulous attention she brought to every policy review, cross-referencing vendor information against industry databases, checking resort credentials, analyzing weather patterns and historical data for the Florida Keys during their planned wedding dates, essentially conducting the comprehensive risk assessment that was her professional responsibility, regardless of personal feelings or family connections. She drafted her initial assessment report, documenting every concern with specific evidence and clear reasoning, knowing that this particular policy would likely receive additional scrutiny from management simply because of the family connection. The report identified multiple deficiencies that would need to be addressed before approval could be recommended, and most significantly, recommended that the coverage limit be increased to $7 million, given the scope of the event and the potential exposure to catastrophic losses if multiple elements failed simultaneously. The envelope had arrived at Rachel's office on Monday morning, hand-delivered by Brandon himself, and she'd been surprised to see him standing at her desk, looking uncomfortable and awkward. She'd invited him to sit down, offered coffee, and he'd made small talk for a few uncomfortable minutes before finally getting to the point of his visit, explaining that they'd been working with Melissa's parents and the wedding planner to finalize the guest list and manage the budget, and unfortunately, they'd realized they'd significantly overextended themselves financially, and they needed to make some difficult cuts. After careful consideration, they decided that the ceremony itself needed to be limited to absolute immediate family only, which meant parents and siblings exclusively. And while of course Rachel would still be invited to the welcome reception and the after-party events, she wouldn't be attending the actual wedding ceremony because that was being restricted to just the most essential family members. Rachel had sat very still in her office chair, processing this information with the same analytical approach she brought to risk assessment, trying to understand the logic of a budget-cutting strategy that eliminated specific guests from one event while maintaining them on the list for other potentially more expensive events. She'd asked him, keeping her voice carefully neutral despite the hurt blooming in her chest, whether other aunts and uncles were still invited to the ceremony, and Brandon's hesitation, followed by an apologetic explanation that, yes, Some other relatives were still attending because they were specifically requested by Melissa's family, or because they were funding certain aspects of the wedding, had told Rachel everything she needed to know about where she actually ranked in the hierarchy of importance. She'd managed to maintain her composure throughout the rest of that conversation, had thanked Brandon for coming to tell her in person, had assured him that she understood budget constraints, all while internally processing the profound rejection and recalibrating her understanding of their relationship. After Brandon had left her office, Rachel had sat quietly for nearly an hour, staring at the insurance application file on her computer screen, thinking about the cosmic irony of being deemed not important enough to witness her nephew's wedding ceremony while simultaneously holding the professional power to determine whether that ceremony had the insurance protection it needed. She'd felt a complicated mixture of hurt and anger, and something that felt uncomfortably close to vindictive satisfaction, recognizing that she could technically make their lives very difficult, but also recognizing that such actions would be ethically wrong because her professional responsibilities existed independently of her personal feelings. Rachel had pulled herself together and returned to her desk to continue her work with deliberate focus on the ethical obligations of her profession rather than the emotional turmoil of her personal situation. She'd completed her underwriting assessment of Brandon and Melissa's insurance application with scrupulous fairness, identifying every legitimate concern, documenting every deficiency with clear explanations, making no special exceptions but also imposing no additional obstacles beyond what proper risk management genuinely required. The response from Melissa's family had come through a phone call directly to Rachel's supervisor from Richard Patterson, Melissa's father, who identified himself as a successful commercial real estate developer and was very concerned about unnecessary delays being placed in the path of his daughter's wedding insurance approval. Rachel's supervisor, Thomas, had listened with professional courtesy before explaining that all high-value event policies underwent thorough underwriting review regardless of who submitted them, that Rachel Hartman was Premier Life's most experienced underwriter, and that if she had identified deficiencies, then those deficiencies existed and needed to be addressed. Thomas had then asked Richard directly whether he was suggesting that his daughter's application should receive abbreviated review or that legitimate risk factors should be ignored because of his professional status, and the silence that followed had been substantial before Richard backtracked. Thomas transferred the call to Rachel, and she walked Richard through her assessment with professional patience, describing each requirement and why it existed, offering practical suggestions for efficiently gathering the additional documentation. The corrected application had arrived 12 days later, with most of the documentation requirements adequately addressed. But the coverage limit issue remained unresolved, with the application still requesting $5 million, despite Rachel's explicit recommendation that $7 million would provide appropriate protection. Rachel had sat with this decision point for a considerable time, reviewing industry standards and ultimately arriving at a conclusion that she could approve the policy at the $5 million limit if she added specific exclusions and conditions that would limit Premier Life's exposure, while still providing substantial coverage for the majority of likely claim situations. She'd drafted a conditional approval letter explaining that the policy could be issued at the requested limit if the applicants agreed to specific exclusions for certain vendor failure scenarios and weather-related cancellation situations where the policy would pay out reduced amounts rather than full replacement costs. The letter explained these trade-offs clearly and in detail, noted that higher coverage limits would provide more comprehensive protection, and emphasized that the approved policy would still protect them against most likely claim scenarios, but would leave them with potential personal exposure in certain catastrophic situations. The explosion had come within hours of the letter being sent, not through professional channels, but through a series of increasingly angry text messages from Brandon that made Rachel's hands shake as she read them. Accusations that she was deliberately sabotaging his wedding because her feelings were hurt about not being invited to the ceremony. Claims that she was hiding behind insurance technicalities to punish him and Melissa. Threats that if she didn't approve their policy without all these ridiculous exclusions, he would file a formal complaint and report her to the state insurance commissioner for misconduct motivated by personal vendettas. He'd written that Melissa was devastated and crying, that her parents were furious and threatening legal action, that the whole family was talking about what Rachel was doing, and that if she went through with blocking their insurance, he would make sure everyone knew exactly what kind of person she really was, and she would never be welcome at any family gathering again. Rachel had read these messages, sitting in her car in the Premier Life parking lot, her professional composure fracturing as tears blurred her vision, not because of the threats, but because of the fundamental misunderstanding of who she was and what she valued. She'd spent 23 years building a reputation for integrity and fair dealing, had made decisions that sometimes cost her professionally because those decisions were correct according to industry standards, and the nephew she'd loved his entire life apparently believed she would throw all of that away out of petty revenge over a wedding invitation. Instead of responding, Rachel had forwarded Brandon's text messages to Thomas with a brief note documenting that she was being accused of personal bias and professional misconduct. Thomas had responded immediately, calling Rachel to his office and telling her that he'd personally reviewed her underwriting file and everything was absolutely appropriate and professionally sound, that the exclusions and conditions she'd recommended were entirely standard for policies where the coverage limit was below the underwriter's optimal assessment, and that she had actually been more generous than required. Thomas had suggested that perhaps she should recuse herself from final approval of the policy to remove any perception of conflict of interest, but Rachel had declined, explaining that recusing herself would send a message that there was something inappropriate about her handling when there wasn't, and that she believed insurance professionals shouldn't be intimidated or forced aside when they made difficult but correct decisions. Thomas had told her he would support whatever decision she made, but warned her that standing on principle often meant standing alone, that family members who felt entitled to special treatment rarely forgave the relatives who refused to provide it. Rachel had gone home that evening and told David everything, and his response had been characteristically direct, telling Rachel that she'd done nothing wrong and everything right, that her nephew was behaving like an entitled child, and that if Brandon couldn't see the difference between professional integrity and personal vindictiveness, then maybe he needed to learn that lesson the hard way. The formal complaint had arrived at Premier Life's corporate office 5 days later from Richard Patterson's attorney, a 12-page legal document alleging professional misconduct, conflict of interest, and abuse of discretionary authority by Rachel, claiming that she had imposed arbitrary restrictions, applied standards inconsistently, and was pursuing a personal vendetta. The complaint was accompanied by affidavits from Melissa and her mother describing Rachel as a difficult family member who had always been resentful of people with more social success and financial resources, never mentioning the actual timeline of events or the fact that Rachel had been excluded from the wedding before ever seeing their insurance application. Thomas had been blunt in his assessment, telling Rachel this was a classic intimidation tactic from people with legal resources who assumed they could bully insurance companies into backing down, and they'd badly miscalculated. The official investigation had been completed in less than 2 weeks, finding absolutely no merit to any of the allegations, and concluding that the complaint appeared to be motivated by disappointment about not receiving the exact policy terms they wanted, rather than by any actual professional misconduct. The situation had attracted attention from industry publications when someone leaked information about the complaint to a blogger who covered insurance industry controversies, framing the story as a cautionary tale about insurance companies using technicalities to deny coverage and about family members who abused professional positions to settle personal scores. The insurance industry community response had been swift and largely supportive of Rachel, with multiple underwriters posting comments explaining why coverage limits matter and why responsible underwriting sometimes means telling clients things they don't want to hear. A respected insurance industry journalist named Patricia Morrison had reached out to Rachel, explaining that she'd been following the controversy and something about it seemed incomplete and one-sided. And when she'd started researching standard practices, she'd found patterns that suggested the Patterson family's complaint might be more about entitlement than about actual misconduct. Patricia's article had published 8 days later as a comprehensive analysis, meticulously researched with interviews from multiple experts, clear documentation of standard practices, and most importantly, a timeline showing that Rachel had been excluded from Brandon's wedding before his insurance application had even reached her desk. The industry response to Patricia's article had been overwhelmingly supportive of Rachel, with insurance professionals across the country expressing frustration about clients who viewed professional guidance as obstacles to overcome rather than expertise to respect. Rachel had been officially commended by Premier Life's executive leadership at a regional meeting, recognized for maintaining professional standards under extraordinary pressure and for exemplifying the kind of principled decision-making that protected both the company and its clients. Brandon and Melissa had ultimately accepted the policy approval with its conditions and exclusions, submitting their signed acceptance 3 days before Premier Life's deadline, apparently having consulted with other insurance providers and discovered that the alternatives were either more expensive or from less reputable companies. The wedding date had arrived with perfect spring weather in the Florida Keys, and Rachel had not attended any of the wedding events, had deliberately scheduled herself to work that entire weekend. One of her colleagues had quietly brought her favorite tea and homemade cookies mid-morning on the day of Brandon's ceremony, a small gesture of solidarity that had meant more to Rachel than any official recognition. The ceremony had apparently proceeded without incident according to social media posts that Rachel deliberately didn't look at, and Brandon and Melissa had gotten their destination wedding and their elaborate celebration and their perfect moments, all protected by the insurance policy that Rachel had carefully underwritten to provide substantial coverage. Rachel had felt genuinely relieved that their wedding had gone smoothly, not because she'd been hoping for disaster, but because she'd never wanted Brandon to suffer. She'd simply wanted him to have appropriate insurance protection and to understand that professional standards existed for good reasons. The months following the wedding had brought unexpected developments that felt like natural consequences of character and choices revealing themselves over time. Richard Patterson's law firm had been investigated by the State Bar Association after multiple complaints from other service providers who had experienced similar intimidation tactics. And while the investigation hadn't resulted in formal sanctions, it had generated enough negative publicity that several major clients had quietly moved their business elsewhere. Melissa's social media presence had actually suffered rather than benefited from all the controversy, with her follower count dropping significantly after people learned more context about the insurance situation. Brandon had reached out to Rachel 7 months after the wedding, not through text message, but through a handwritten letter that arrived at her home, several pages of careful writing attempting to articulate things he apparently couldn't say in person or over the phone. He'd written that he'd had a lot of time to think about everything that had happened, that he'd been talking with a counselor who was helping him recognize patterns in his own behavior, patterns of conflict avoidance and people-pleasing that had led him to make choices he now regretted deeply. He'd acknowledged that Rachel had been right about the insurance coverage, that during their honeymoon, a severe tropical storm had forced them to evacuate the resort early, and while their insurance policy had covered most expenses, there had been gaps in coverage exactly where Rachel had warned them gaps would exist, and those gaps had cost them several $1,000s that would have been covered if they'd accepted her recommendation for higher coverage limits. He'd admitted that he'd let Melissa and her parents convince him that Rachel was the problem when the reality was that she'd been doing exactly what she'd always done, providing expert guidance and trying to protect him from consequences he wasn't mature enough to anticipate. Before we go any further, I need to pause here and speak directly to your heart, because if you've stayed with me through Rachel's entire journey so far, then you understand something profound about the cost of integrity and the loneliness of standing firm when everyone around you is demanding that you compromise your principles. I want to hear from you, really truly hear from you, in the comments below, because your story matters just as much as Rachel's story matters. Have you ever had to choose between being liked and being right? Have you ever lost relationships because you refused to bend your professional standards or compromise your values? Tell me your story. Share your experience. Let your voice be heard in this space where authenticity and honesty are valued more than popularity. And if you're finding real meaning and value in what we share here, please subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss the stories we bring you each week. Your presence here matters more than you know, and I'm so grateful you've chosen to be part of this community. Now let's see how Rachel's story reaches its resolution, because what happens next will show you that integrity always has consequences, but those consequences aren't always what we expect. The letter had included an apology, more genuine and thoughtful than Rachel had expected, acknowledging specific ways he'd hurt her, the cruelty of excluding her from his ceremony after she'd been part of every important moment in his life, the injustice of accusing her of professional misconduct when she'd been acting with integrity, the betrayal of choosing his in-laws' approval over defending someone who had always defended him. Brandon had asked if perhaps they could talk sometime, not to restore their relationship to what it had been, because he understood that wasn't realistic, but just to have a conversation where he could apologize properly in person. Rachel had sat with that letter for 3 weeks, reading it multiple times, discussing it with David, and she'd ultimately called him, agreeing to meet for coffee at a neutral location. They'd met 4 days later, both arriving early and awkward, and Rachel had been struck by how different Brandon looked, the easy confidence replaced by something more uncertain and genuinely remorseful. He'd started with the apology, speaking the words directly to her face, acknowledging the harm he'd caused without excuses, just owning that he'd made terrible choices that had hurt someone who had never been anything but supportive throughout his entire life. Rachel had listened without interrupting, and when he'd finished, she'd told him that she forgave him, not because his apology had earned forgiveness, but because she'd already decided to forgive him for her own peace, because carrying anger and resentment was exhausting. But forgiveness, she'd continued gently but firmly, didn't automatically mean restoration of their previous relationship, because what had happened had revealed things about his character that she couldn't unsee, and trust once broken required time and consistent behavior to rebuild. She told him she was willing to maintain some level of connection, but that process would move at her pace and would be contingent on his actions over time rather than on his current feelings or promises. They'd parted that day with a brief hug that felt both familiar and strange, and Rachel had driven home feeling lighter than expected, recognizing that closure didn't require complete reconciliation. In the months that followed, Brandon had respected her boundaries, sending occasional brief emails, never demanding responses, sharing that he and Melissa had separated and were pursuing divorce after realizing their marriage had been built on surface compatibility rather than on genuine partnership. Rachel had responded occasionally with brief, supportive messages, maintaining appropriate emotional distance, and slowly, over time, they'd begun building some kind of connection that wasn't what they'd had before, but that was perhaps more authentic because it was based on realistic understanding rather than on idealized assumptions. The situation had brought unexpected gifts in other relationships, deepening connections with colleagues who had supported her, strengthening her appreciation for David's steady presence, reconnecting her with extended family members who had reached out during the difficult weeks. Premier Life had implemented new protocols based on Rachel's experience, creating clearer documentation requirements for handling situations where underwriters had personal connections to policy applicants, establishing formal support systems for employees who faced intimidation from clients, developing training programs about maintaining professional boundaries. Rachel had been asked to help develop some of these new protocols, and there had been something deeply satisfying about transforming personal pain into institutional improvements. The insurance industry had recognized Rachel's contribution beyond just her company, with the National Association of Insurance Underwriters selecting her for their annual Professional Integrity Award, an honor that came with recognition at their national conference and an invitation to speak about maintaining ethical standards under pressure. The speaking engagement had been both challenging and cathartic, standing before an audience of insurance professionals trying to articulate lessons from an experience that was still somewhat tender. She'd talked about the importance of documentation, about the necessity of institutional support, and about the personal cost of principled professional conduct, about accepting that doing your job correctly sometimes meant being misunderstood and attacked. A senior underwriter from California had shared during the question session that she'd faced a similar situation years earlier, had given in to pressure from a prominent client to approve coverage that didn't meet her standards, and that client's event had experienced catastrophic problems that resulted in massive claims, and she'd carried guilt ever since. She'd looked directly at Rachel and told her that reading about her situation had inspired her to be more rigorous in her own work, that Rachel should know her integrity had ripple effects she would never fully see. Rachel had thanked her with emotion, understanding in that moment the full significance of what she'd been through and why it had mattered so much to maintain her standards. The relationship with Brandon had continued to evolve slowly over the following year, moving from occasional emails to more frequent phone calls, and Rachel had watched with guarded hope as he seemed to genuinely work on the character issues he'd acknowledged, making efforts to reconnect with other family members, setting clearer boundaries in his relationships, making choices that reflected his own values rather than simply accommodating whoever was applying the most pressure. 18 months after their first reconciliation conversation, Brandon had asked if he could bring someone to meet Rachel and David, explaining that he'd been seeing someone for several months, a teacher named Sarah who shared his values, and he wanted Rachel's perspective because her opinion mattered to him. Rachel had agreed to meet Sarah and had been genuinely impressed by the woman Brandon brought to their home, someone who was warm and authentic and clearly grounded in reality rather than in social media performance. During that visit, Brandon had pulled Rachel aside for a private conversation in her home office, the same room where she'd processed his insurance application, and he told her something that brought tears to both their eyes, that he'd recently reviewed the insurance policy from his wedding to Melissa, and he could see now with painful clarity how right she'd been about everything, how the gaps in coverage had cost them money during the honeymoon disruption, how her professional judgment had actually protected him from even worse consequences, and how his accusation that she'd been sabotaging his wedding was actually the opposite of the truth. He'd apologized again, more deeply and specifically than before, for not trusting her expertise, for choosing to believe she was being vindictive rather than professional, for allowing others to convince him that someone who had never given him reason to doubt her integrity was suddenly acting from petty revenge. And he'd thanked her for maintaining her standards, even when doing so cost her their relationship, for refusing to compromise her professional judgment even when compromising would have been easier, because he could see now that her willingness to stand firm had actually been an expression of love and respect. Rachel had hugged him then, really hugged him for the first time since before the wedding invitation had arrived and changed everything, and she'd told him she was proud of the work he was doing to understand himself better and to grow beyond the patterns that had caused so much pain, and that while their relationship would never be exactly what it had been before, perhaps it could become something different, and maybe even stronger because it was now built on truth and tested by difficulty. On a quiet evening in autumn, exactly 3 years after the insurance application had landed on her desk and changed so much, Rachel stood at the window of her home office, looking out at the neighborhood painted in sunset colors, and thought about paths taken and not taken, about who she'd become through this experience and who she might have been if she'd chosen differently. That alternate version of Rachel, who had approved Brandon's insurance at inadequate coverage limits to avoid family conflict, would have kept him in her life without interruption, but would also have carried different weights, the knowledge that she'd compromised her professional oath and potentially left her nephew vulnerable to catastrophic financial exposure. She thought about Brandon and Melissa's honeymoon disaster when the tropical storm had forced early evacuation, about how much worse that situation could have been if the policy hadn't included the protections Rachel had insisted on despite their complaints, proving that her supposedly vindictive underwriting decisions had actually been expressions of professional care and responsibility that had protected them even while they were attacking her character. David appeared at her office door, having finished preparing their dinner and ready to call her to the table, and he smiled at her with the warmth and steady affection that had sustained their marriage through 3 decades and this particularly challenging chapter. As they sat down to dinner together, David asked if she was okay, and Rachel considered the question carefully before answering with complete honesty that yes, she was more than okay, because through all of this she'd learned something fundamental about herself, that she was someone who could stand alone when necessary, someone whose integrity wasn't conditional on other people's approval, someone who could face pressure and threats and public criticism and family estrangement and still wake up every morning certain that she'd made the right choices for the right reasons, and that certainty was worth more than any relationship that required her to compromise those principles to maintain it. They ate dinner together in comfortable companionship, And Rachel felt genuinely at peace with the complicated journey of the past 3 years, with the choices she'd made, and the costs she'd paid, and the person she'd become through it all. Somewhere Brandon was building a new relationship with someone who seemed genuinely good for him, learning his own lessons about character and courage. Somewhere other insurance underwriters were facing their own pressure from entitled clients. And because of Rachel's experience and the systems built from it, those underwriters had better tools and stronger institutional support. The insurance policy that had almost destroyed a family relationship had become a story with unexpected outcomes and lasting value, a testament to the importance of professional integrity, to the cost and worth of maintaining standards even under intense personal pressure. Rachel Hartman had passed that test, had discovered reserves of strength and conviction she'd hoped she possessed, but had never needed to fully access until circumstances demanded everything she had transformed personal pain into professional improvements that would serve her industry for years beyond her own career. And as David reached across the table to squeeze her hand, Rachel smiled back, knowing that she'd walked through fire and emerged not unscathed but uncompromised, carrying scars that told a story of integrity maintained and principles defended and a professional life lived according to standards that would outlast any temporary approval or disapproval from people who couldn't see beyond their immediate desires to the larger framework of protection and fairness that responsible professionals created and maintained for everyone's benefit.